Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this special presentation of a GAMA webinar brought to you by GAMA and Steam Logistics. Today, we're going to be talking about understanding the current tariff environment and some mitigation strategies. And with us, we have practically the whole team from Steam Logistics. I'm going to start by introducing Tony Seay, who is an account executive, and he'll get us started. Hey, Tony.
Hey, good afternoon, and thank you so much for that introduction, David. It's a pleasure to be here, and Steam Logistics is always happy to help the gaming community, as we've done for multiple years now. I want to introduce you really to the main stars of today's show. That's going to be Mr. Steve Smith. He is our Senior VP of Customs and Compliance. He's been in this business for a very long time as a broker, freight forwarder, and all around just wonderful human being. With him today is also going to be the Director of Customs, Miss Amanda Frame. Just another lovely human being, has the softest, kindest voice. He'll be able to walk you through everything. And again, if you have any questions, just thank you again for being here, and I'm going to hand it off to Steve.
Thanks very much, Tony. I appreciate you kicking us off here. I will handle the first part of the presentation here and go through our agenda and several other points related to this, and hopefully we can have a good experience walking through all of this with you today. Our agenda here today, if you take a look at the slide we have up, we're going to talk about just from a basic standpoint of what the tariffs are, why these things exist, and kind of how they operate there. A little bit about how that has evolved over time, over the last several decades at least. And then we can talk about what we're into today with this chaotic environment that we're all living in there and how it affects different countries and products. We'll run through some of the different points there and get into the specifics of what these different layers of the tariffs are that have been put in place, both back in 2018, 2019, and then some of the different things that have happened through the year here in 2025, which has certainly been an exciting and interesting time for everyone involved. We will walk through a little bit of the exclusions here on various products, and some of these things I know won't apply specifically to this group and everything that you're involved in. Hopefully we can hit on a lot of things that are relevant, but I think as part of this presentation, we wanted to give you an overview of all of the different aspects of this and talk about it from the big picture and then get into some of the details. So forgive us if certain aspects of this don't apply directly to you, but I think it helps paint the picture in a big way as far as how all this fits together. We do have some information here about how to navigate some of these topics, and we'll get into that, as well as some ancillary topics for importers and buyers to be concerned with there that come into play really on the customs side, and how it affects not only the duties and things that are paid, but some of the other things that come into play related to life as an importer and all the responsibilities there and liabilities as well. We're going to touch on the retaliation that you see from some of the other countries based on the tariffs that have been implemented on our side. And then we'll talk a little bit about how you can get guidance on these issues and navigate this so you get good information to make decisions with, which is critical for anyone who's in this world of international trade here. Jordan, if you want to hop to the next one here. There we go. So one of the things I wanted to start off here with is just talking about what the tariffs are and where this comes from. And, I apologize to anybody who's, already up to their eyeballs in this industry and knows all of this inside and out, but I figured we might have some people here that, are new to this or just trying to get an understanding of how all of these different parts fit together. Tariffs, by definition, are trade barriers. They're hoops that you have to jump through, or costs that are put in place with the main purpose of protecting domestic industry here in the U.S. or for any country in the world that has these tariffs in place. and they're charged against the import of those products that are coming into a country from other trading partners around the world. And there are several purposes like we have listed out here. I think revenue is a piece of that, and for a lot of nations out there, that could be their primary reason for having the tariffs in place. I think more on the United States side, it would have been for the protection of domestic industry and that side of it, and that would have been the main goal behind it originally. So you want to get us to the next one. We'll talk a little bit about how this has evolved here. No, I'm sorry. We can say this. You're right. My apologies there. Just off track a little bit. The history of this, when you look at what has been done over the past 30 to 50 years with the U.S. side, is that for the most part, the trade barriers have just been removed one by one. One of the large things that happened in the 1990s is that we gave China most favored nation status. Prior to that, they would not have been able to pay the normal duty rates that the country has with all their trading partners around the world. These are referred to as column 1 duties within the tariff system, and those are, they may range from duty free up to 100%, but the bulk of the tariffs that are out there are in the very low figures. You're talking about from free to maybe 2 and 5 and 7%. Textiles may have been higher, and there are some of those that are still out there. But for the most part, you've seen these normal tariffs in place for our trading partners around the world. But China did not have access to that. They would have paid column 2 duty rates. And way back then, we would have had column 2 duty rates for countries like all of those Eastern European countries with the part of the Soviet Union and that. So if you were importing from those countries, you paid much higher duty rates. That could be from 20% to 70%, drastically higher than what you would see with the column 1 rates that you would pay for countries with that normalized trade relations or most favored nation status. That all changed for China in the 90s, and they moved to that MFN status, which gave them access to those column 1 duty rates. And imports from China would have, underwent much lower tariffs. And in that case, you can see that the door opens to drastically moving production to that country. Further to that big step taking place in the 90s, everything that you've seen since has been along those lines of removing trade barriers. And so we had the NAFTA put in place, which has been transformed now into the USMCA, so that opened the door to free trade with Canada and Mexico. And then all of the manufacturers and the people operating in the trade with the Caribbean, which had historically had a lot of trade with the U.S., where you had, especially on the textile side, you had a lot of U.S. manufacturers of fabric and things like that, moving product down to the Caribbean because it's a couple of days on the water each direction. You could do cutting and sewing down there and import the goods back into the U.S. And they wanted the same level of treatment they were getting under NAFTA. They wanted that duty-free treatment as well, and so they lobbied, and CAFTA was put in place. So you have the Central American Free Trade Agreement, and then you just see a slew of other ones put in place. We have the United States has free trade agreements in place with Australia, Chile, Peru, Colombia, just any number of countries, South Korea, Israel, Singapore. And so as you've progressed here, you really see that the trade barriers have been removed. We've seen nothing but the duty rates being lowered over time, just incrementally stepping their way down to lower and lower numbers. And then you see a lot of these other free trade agreements, which get you to either free or a much reduced duty rate that's even lower than the normal column 1 rates, which are low to begin with. So that's kind of what we've seen over the past 30 years plus, and that's certainly what's happened within my career. But what that's led to, and I think, Jordan, if you want to go there, yeah, thank you. It kind of leads to what today's environment, the net result of all of those actions that have been taken over time. It's led to a massive shift in U.S. manufacturing. With those trade barriers removed, you've seen this flood of production move to other countries around the world. You see the U.S. running trade deficits, massive trade deficits with our largest three trading partners, which is China, Mexico, and Canada, but also trade deficits with just about every player in this with countries around the world. There are very few where the U.S. exports would outnumber what we have in place for the U.S. Versus the U.S. import piece. When you add up everything as a whole for all of the countries, trading partners, you're running a trade deficit, something approaching $1 trillion annually, and so that's a huge amount of wealth that's being moved, that's being offshored there in that process, as well as doing away with all of those jobs here within the U.S. And so I just wanted to go through all of that to kind of set the stage for where we are right now and what the purpose is behind implementing all of these new tariffs that we're seeing now, and why there's this massive push. I think it's a necessary step to try to find a way towards a more fair and balanced trade that we have with our trading partners around the world, and certainly a painful process to go through for anyone who's involved in it, like I am and have been for my entire career. It's hard to see this, and it's certainly a hard environment to work through that we're all scrambling to navigate right now together with our customers and with customs and with our software providers and with overseas partners, manufacturers and things like that. It's a major upheaval, and it's happened in very short order. This is not something that's played out over several years to try to find a way forward and a way to a better place, a healthier place for the U.S. economy. This is something that's just played out over the matter of a couple of months, really. And so it's been a major shift, and it's been created a lot of chaos within the industry. Go to the next one there. Yeah. When we start looking at what we have here as far as the different layers of this, some of this does go back to the first administration of President Trump, and there were really two major initiatives at that point. You had the Section 301 tariffs that were implemented, which affected strictly Chinese products. This was, for the most part, a 25% tariff that was put in place, and that is mostly still in effect now. There were processes for importers to be able to specifically request exclusion from those tariffs. There was a process that was offered and was followed by quite a few people to be able to exclude certain products. And generally, those products were products that were in short supply within the U.S., and so they had a reasonable case for requesting an exclusion to those products, and to be able to say that these are not easily sourceable within the country here by manufacturers and by retailers or anyone else. And so there were exclusions that were granted. Some of those exclusions have expiration dates, and so that would only be granted for a fixed amount of time and be available to those importers of those products. So there were some ways around that. The other main piece that was put in place was what they refer to as Section 232. And so these are all of the steel and aluminum products. And this related not just to China, but to all countries around the world. These tariffs were put in place, and this ranged anywhere from 7.5% to 25% for these products. And like I said, it affected every country out there. There was an exclusion process for this as well. And I think that really led to some of the things that are being done this year, because when they originally implemented this, they had a 25% goal for these products. And the point of that tariff now being, again, these are trade barriers, and these are being put back in place as barriers to buying from certain countries or buying certain products from different countries. And so the goal with the Section 232 duties or tariffs would be to drive U.S. production, to kind of reignite that here on this side, and inspire manufacturers and buyers of these products to do more of that manufacturing on the U.S. side. With the exclusion processes that were implemented, both under Trump originally, and then what was put in place under the Biden administration, it really eroded a lot of the teeth, I guess, of the Section 232 duties in particular. When you look at that as of now, as of the beginning of this year, so many exclusions were granted, and amounts were reduced, special groups of products were implemented that had lower than the original 25%. And it really took away the main driving force behind the tariffs, and you weren't able to push forward kind of what the agenda was for having those to begin with. And so that really sets the stage for where we ended up with this year. And so if you look at how these things were implemented through the year this year, they revisited the Section 232 tariffs and pushed those things back up to 25% for steel and aluminum products. It is not just for steel and aluminum pure, if you're thinking about sheets of steel or steel bars or steel rods or steel wire, or the same for the aluminum side. It also includes the derivative products there and all of the other things that are made out of that, which really goes into just about everything out there, from furniture, electronics, computers, all kinds of other different products that are out there. And that basically is, again, trying to put that impetus in place to drive production back to the U.S. They have the main exclusion from those steel and aluminum tariffs is if you are making steel and smelting it here within the U.S. And then you can do your manufacturing wherever you want to do it, but the steel should come from the U.S. and that's how you avoid these tariffs. When you look at some of the derivative products where you have steel components, but you're not, the primary components, or it's not the sole component in a product like a desk or a chair or something like that. You have other textile, plastic, and wood products mixed in with it. What the rules and regulations around this dictate is that the 25% for steel or aluminum only applies to those products, specifically the portion that is steel or aluminum. And so that's another hoop to jump through, and we'll talk about that a little bit as well, because that's more information that we have to be able to provide. When you think about this product coming into the country, you have quite a bit of information already. We have to have the value of the product. We need to know the origin of the product. We need to know what the product is so that we can properly classify it. All of these things go into factoring what the duty rate would be and what tariffs may or may not apply for that product. And a portion of that now, another thing that everyone has to account for is that we also will have to, as a broker, if you think about any broker clearing this product through customs for it to come into the country, you're now going to have additional information on that product and the value and really break out on the documentation what is steel, what is aluminum, and what is not, in the values of those products. And we've had some really interesting conversations as a customs broker with our customers around that. It can get very technical for one thing, and that there's challenges there because you want to have good information in order to make your decisions. But another component is for our customers, the importers here in the U.S., is trying to get that information from their suppliers. Yes, their suppliers make these products and they know what they need in order to be able to make it as far as the raw materials for steel, plastic, wood, aluminum, textiles, anything else that goes into making up all those various products that can be entered into the country. But one of the things that we've seen a challenge is their record keeping for the details of that. And so if for us as a customs broker, we have to know this information on what the value and the content of the steel and aluminum in these products in order to be able to file that properly with customs and to pay the proper duties on it. If you don't have that kind of a breakdown, then the rules dictate that the steel and aluminum 25% applies to the full value of the product. And then in that situation, you're paying much more money into the government than would be necessary or required. And so it's a piece of the puzzle here that's going to require everyone adapting to new procedures and new ways of documenting this information and providing it downstream to a customs broker who's declaring this to U.S. Customs upon importation into the country. So it's just a new territory for everyone that's involved in that. Not only us as the broker, there's new functionality within our systems. So there's a software component to this, but there's also new information that the importers would be responsible for providing, and they're going to have to get that from their manufacturers. So there's communication that's going to happen there. It's just a whole new reality that everyone has to adjust to. And that's just one little piece of that larger puzzle. So Section 232 tariffs are something, I apologize. Sorry, Jordan. Section 232 tariffs are one piece of the tariffs that have been put in place for this year to basically revamp those and push them back up to where they were several years ago when they were first implemented, basically to give that whole piece of the tariff puzzle more teeth to try to drive the change that they're looking for there. And like I mentioned before, we still have the Section 301 tariffs for China that were implemented several years ago. Those are still in place. And so that's something to consider. Then the other thing that has come along between the months of February and March relate to this issue of fentanyl and these anti-fentanyl initiatives that we've seen. Our trade, I think the focus for this really was centered on China, Canada, and Mexico, simply for the fact that they are our largest trading partners and that we share a border with two of those countries. And that is how a lot of these illegal narcotics enter the country. They have implemented, for China particularly, a tariff of 10% back in February, and then that was augmented by another 10% that came out in March. So we have a 20% duty on those products that was put in place earlier this year. And that is separate from that 25% of the Section 301. It's a different purpose behind that. They suspended a lot of the Canada and Mexico pieces after conversations with those countries. At this point right now, we still have exemptions for those tariffs if the products qualify under what was NAFTA and is now USMCA. So if they qualify for duty-free treatment under that program, then you're basically avoiding those tariffs at this point. That could change in the future, but the main thing that is in place right now is this 20% for China in this this particular tariff. So those were done in February and March. Those were implemented, and those have been in place since then, that totaling 20% for China there. Then that kind of brings us up to the next piece that was put in place in April, early April, as far as automobiles. This is another layer to the Section 232 tariffs, and this is on automobiles, and it's automobiles and light trucks that there's a 25% tariff on. And at this point, still for this, there's an exemption for Canada and Mexico in the same way that there is for the fentanyl tariffs. If it's qualifying under the USMCA as duty-free, then they've exempted it from this steel and aluminum tariff, and they've exempted it from this automotive tariff. On May 3rd, there's another piece to that, Section 232, which is the automotive parts. That'll be implemented, and so you'll see a new tariff there on top of the one for automobiles and light trucks themselves. This pretty well takes us up to the, sorry, not quite done there, Jordan. I keep throwing you off there. One last point is, and it's a big one, is the reciprocal tariffs. This is the latest thing that the administration has rolled out. The idea at first was that you would have, for a very brief period, a 10% tariff on products of all countries. And this was in retaliation to all of the tariffs that these foreign countries have on U.S. products or U.S. exports, and trying to bring attention to and get those countries to negotiate a more fair trade, more equilateral that way, to where there's a level playing field for U.S. products that are going into those countries, but that have been traditionally, they have very large barriers on their side that far outweighed what the U.S. had in place. And so originally they were going to put a 10% tariff on all the products of all countries. As I mentioned, that was only going to be for a very short time period before country-specific rates were in place. Those country-specific rates were ranging anywhere from 10 and 20%. I think the European Union was going to be 20%. You had other countries that were much higher. China originally was going to be 34% in that process, really before they could even come into effect. China was announcing additional tariffs on their side, and another chunk was added to the amount for China on our side. And so it went from 34% to 84%. And then after some further back and forth, that finally was set and went into effect at 125%. There was an agreement reached, or at least discussion initiated, with a lot of other countries that allowed a pause on the reciprocal tariffs for those other trading partners. And so there was a 90-day pause put in place. So no further action is planned to be taken for that time. And that 10% for each of those countries is in effect now for products that are entering the country here, for everything except for China. For China, it was set at 125%, and everywhere else it was set at 10%. What a lot of things that you see out there on the news and you see in other publications, they're talking about 145%, but they're kind of confusing the fact or the different programs that have come out here. The 125% is the reciprocal tariff amount for China, and the 20% difference there between the 145 and 125 is the 20% for the fentanyl tariffs that was already implemented earlier this year. So generally, when you see this in the news or in other publications out there, they're not really breaking out those as two different things. We in the industry, and certainly as a customs broker, we see them as different things. And even within our system, there are different provisional tariff codes that we have to enter in our system to account for all of these things. And those are completely different programs with different codes associated to them. So I just look at them as totally different things, even though they do layer together. what's interesting with that to me is that you don't hear a lot of people talking about the other Section 301 tariffs that are still out there. Maybe they just accept that as normal now, as part of importing from China. But when you look at it, beyond that normal column 1 duty rate that you would pay within the tariff for products from any country, when you look at China in particular, you have Section 301 tariffs from several years ago, which is 25%. Then you add the fentanyl tariffs of 20% from earlier this year, and then the reciprocal tariffs. So really, to me, the total that we talk about in all of our communications with customers is 170% in that case. And so it is quite substantial, and is night and day in comparison to, what you would look at for Vietnam or Malaysia or Canada, Mexico, or any of the European countries, or trading partners like Japan and Taiwan and Korea. Completely different conversation when we look at what's involved for China in particular there. Jordan, I think we can go to the next one here. Another piece that I want to talk about here is with the reciprocal tariffs, because this is such a huge impact. There are a lot of different moving parts with this whole scenario that we're looking at. It's a very complicated world now, with the tariffs that have been put in place one after another, and there's a layering effect that's happening with some of these things, and the exemptions and how the pieces really fit together, product by product and country by country, can be really tricky. It's made for some very complicated conversations with customers, with overseas partners, and even with our own teams who are filing these entries. Not only do we have to know which products and which origin countries are subject to what tariffs, we have to see how they layer together and what might be excluded from one particular tariff and not from another. And then another piece on top of that, as the customs broker, is we actually have to enter all this information in our system in a specific order, in order for the duties to calculate properly. And so it'll only be accepted in a certain order. And so we've had to really get into the nuts and bolts of this and build training around it for our teams, just to be able to navigate this and keep it moving. The interesting piece of that is, imagine doing that without being able to pause all of the cargo that's moving around the world. We have shipments marching towards us for both air and ocean from various countries around the world. Both air shipments move quite a bit faster, and so you have immediate implications for all of these things as they come through. With the reciprocal tariffs, they have laid out very specific exclusions here. When you talk about the reciprocal tariffs for other tariffs that are in place, like the Section 301 duties that came from several years ago, the reciprocal tariff would just be a layer on top of that. And so you would just add those together. You would have the normal column 1 duty rate from the tariff. You would have the Section 301 tariffs for China that were implemented before. And then you would layer on this latest reciprocal tariff, which could be 10% for most countries that trade with the U.S., and then that 125% for China. When you look at certain products, they are excluded from the new reciprocal tariff. So for Canada and Mexico, for those goods that qualify under what was NAFTA but is now USMCA, this is exempted from the reciprocal tariff that was just put in place a couple of weeks ago. Products of steel and aluminum. So we had the Section 232 tariffs. If a product is already subject to the Section 232 tariffs that are in place, then they are excluded from the new reciprocal tariff. So in that scenario, you do not layer on top, even if you're buying from China, you would not layer on top that 125%. You would have the column one duty rate that you're paying normally. You would have the, if it was China, you would have the fentanyl tariffs from earlier in the year, the 20%. And then you would layer on this Section 232 tariff for steel and aluminum.
Stephen, I don't mean to cut you off, but I just want to make a recommendation that our industry doesn't deal in steel or aluminum, and we don't deal in semiconductors or pharmaceuticals or lumber. If we could just skip to the parts that have something to do with cardboard, plastic, or paper, that would be really helpful to the viewers.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. We were just trying to give a kind of an overview of the whole thing and show how all the parts fit together. So
I appreciate that.
Yeah, no problem. You can take a step forward with this and go to the next piece. The other piece of this slide was just to lay out what the different exclusions were here. So. The other piece to this, I guess, would be those very specific under Annex 2. They do have that list of exclusions, but for the most part, the reciprocals outside of the things listed here, that reciprocal tariff would be what you would be expecting to pay with Chinese products or other products from around the world. If it's not a piece of the exclusion here, then that would apply to those different products, and that would be the case for anything that's not already covered in one of these exclusions in this side. I think from there we'll start talking about a little bit of the different paths towards the mitigation, and so I'll let Amanda take over this piece and talk through the next few slides here.
Fun. So I think this is the good part. I think this is where all the questions are going to come into play. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the big things I'm seeing is just tons and tons of questions. What are my options? Where do I go from here? How do I mitigate the costs associated with my imports? So my advice is know your options. They are not going to be the same for every industry. They're not going to be the same for every customer, for every country. Familiarize yourself with that. Know your product. A lot of importers we see will say, we need to ask our supplier. We need to get that information from our manufacturer. Know your product. That's your responsibility. You're the one that's going to need to answer to U.S. Customs. Ensure that you know the compliance associated with it. Some of the most sophisticated importers can find this challenging. So tariff engineering, it's just a way to adjust your product within compliance, but to lower the duty rate. The country of origin can make a huge difference. Can you get that product from a different country? Maybe source a piece of that product from a different country. It can have a significant impact on the duty. Foreign trade zones, that may not be the best option, but understand when it is the best option. Is there a time of year that you would benefit from it? Is there a certain product? Maybe it doesn't apply to all of your goods. Utilize the free trade agreements. If you can source from other countries where there is a free trade agreement, do it. You are definitely going to benefit, and the end user is going to benefit. Stay informed. And I know that sounds like a lot, and I say that from a place where every day I see constant updates, and I see industry-wide updates. So stay informed. Find a broker or a news site that has reliable information. Monitor your product, monitor your industry, and understand what your options are. Understand the changing regulations and check for exclusions. It may be something where you know your product better than your customs broker or better than the factory itself as far as on the import side. So maybe there are exclusions that are options, and you need to check into it. If you don't ask, you'll never know. Leverage customs brokers. We deal with this every day. We see different information. We know we can answer questions about proper classification, documentation, and compliance. Just being compliant can help whenever customs does question things. If you have that information readily available, you can avoid penalties. And sometimes if you have an abundance of information, they may be more willing to help guide you in a better direction, as opposed to just immediately hitting you with fines. And we all want to try to avoid that. Early planning is great, but I think it's hard to do that because we're just kind of thrown into this trade changes and all the trade policies being shifted, and it kind of happened fast. But when you are trying to make these changes, make sure that you're in compliance. You don't want to just immediately go to changing all your classifications, because that will be a red flag. So if you make a change, you need to make sure that you are correct and it is in line with compliance. So along with the tariff increases, there are other impacts on importers. We've seen increased requirements for compliance. There are additional documentation. There are new licenses that may be required. Additional breakdown requirements, depending on what your product includes. So just kind of understanding and having a customs broker who can provide you with support and knowing what those changes are and what information you need to provide. Some of the things that we've seen is going to be your customs bond saturation, and that's a little bit more complex, but basically it's almost like an insurance policy for U.S. Customs to ensure that they get paid the duties and taxes when you import stuff. And so with the rising cost of tariffs, the bonds are being saturated way more quickly. So it is important to make sure that you're aware of those costs and you're keeping up with that, because that is a huge part of your import process. Higher clearance costs and delays. This kind of goes back to knowing your information. There are more holds happening, but ensuring that you know your products, you have valid information, you can provide the information quickly, because when U.S. Customs asks for something, they expect it within 2 business days. You should have that information readily available. Resource allocation toward trade compliance. In the past, we've seen a lot of importers who really just don't want to go down that path. And we understand that's a lot, but at the same time, at the end of the day, that's your assurance that you have the information, your product's going to move smoothly through U.S. Customs, and taking those few extra steps can make a huge, huge impact on it. You don't want to have something sitting at a port for 30 days just because you had to track down your manufacturer for a document in China, because there's a huge turnaround on that. So make sure that you have all the information, and that can help avoid costs and delays. Foreign retaliation. This is more on the export side, and I think that we kind of focus more on the import side. However, it is impacting exports with the same challenges with the global trade. Countries are responding with retaliatory tariffs. Common U.S. exports are targeted. And that kind of varies based on your industry. Especially with China, I know that there are a lot of imports and exports with China in response to the U.S. Section 301 in multiple phases. I think with this, just I don't know that there's necessarily a way around this, but I think also that's also going to come from maybe the sourcing. I don't know that we have a whole lot of leverage over that, but just being aware of what you're up against whenever you are exporting on that side. Tariff guidance and decision making. Always ask questions. Professional guidance from a customs broker. Again, we look at this stuff every day. We know the questions that U.S. Customs are going to ask. If we don't know, we can help you find it. Let your customs broker provide you with information, the guidance you need. Familiarize yourself with the product classification. I kind of gave an example earlier. We were looking at a wood product that had a piece of metal and some magnets in it. And this is one of those situations where, as a customs broker, I know off the top of my head, if you can import the wood part, but then source the magnet and the metal sheet here, you can save tremendously on the tariff on that. And so just simple changes like that, asking your customs broker for that guidance can have a huge financial impact. While we are great with your guidance and we can provide you with information, we are not legal counsel. And some companies are trying to avoid legal counsel, but sometimes at the end of the day, especially for a huge importer or billions and billions of dollar industries, at the end of the day, it is sometimes best to seek legal counsel. You want to ensure that you're, one, getting the best guidance available, and some of the legalities and the terminology can be confusing. So at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you can go to customs and say, this is what our lawyer provided. How can we do this? How can we make this better? Is there a way to defend you against penalties or enforcement cases? So I know that sounds like a lot, but sometimes it is the best option. I think we're good there. I think we can both take questions. Steve and I both, if you have questions. So Megan, I think that's hard to say. I would say a .gov would be the best option. Or if you have a customs attorney, I would ask them to recommend one. I would always be skeptical if it's not a .gov or if it's not a legal institution. There is a site I would go to, U.S. Customs and Border Patrol, and go to the trade option. And they have some links there, including informed compliance, that may be specific to your products. Where do you find customs brokers to contact? We can actually provide you with our email address if you're interested, but there is a link on the U.S. Customs side as well for customs brokers in the U.S. That's actually a great question, and that can vary. So I don't want to lead you in the wrong direction there. It just depends on what it is. Is it a complex entry? What is the country of origin? How many invoices do you have? Just from my perspective, we do try to be competitive, but at the same time, the more that you can help your customs broker, I think the more they can work with you to set a correct price for you. So one of our biggest obstacles is, if you can provide us with valid information and it's all the information needed and we can submit it and it doesn't take an excruciating amount of time, we're not constantly having to request additional information, your pricing can be adjusted. So that's one thing to consider.
I think I could speak to that a little bit, if you don't mind. So there are really two different options here in the U.S. For this type of setup. One is what you're referring to there with a foreign trade zone, and the other would be for a bonded warehouse. We are seeing quite a few customers do this. We've had many conversations with them, and there's a lot of different scenarios there. Some customers are importing a large volume of product into the U.S., and instead of paying duty when that product arrives in the U.S., we do what's called a warehouse entry, and you put that into a bonded warehouse. That really comes into play when you're not manipulating the goods in any way. You're really deferring the duty of that, or you're waiting to see what new tariff may be applied later on. We really, can only speculate about what's going to come here. You would assume at some point there would be an agreement reached with China to bring that massive number down. And it really depends on what the language is in that agreement with what duty would apply. It depends on how they word this new agreement. If they word it like the current agreement, then it would apply based on that entry date when you're pulling it out of that bonded warehouse to make entry on it. Then you would apply the new duty. That's our understanding of it. But that also goes back to what the exact wording of the agreement is. And when it really comes down to the end of the day, you need to really seek counsel on that type of thing and make sure that you have a good understanding of it to be able to make good decisions around it as a business. And that can be your own research. That can be leaning on a customs broker like we are. And that can be just what we referred to in that other slide, where you're going to actual legal counsel, a customs attorney, someone who's an expert in kind of evaluating those different agreements there. The foreign trade zone option, as opposed to the bonded warehouse, foreign trade zone is more if you're going to manipulate the product or do manufacturing that would transform it into something else. If you're just storing it to wait and see what is going to happen with the tariffs and maybe pull it out after some agreement has been reached, but you have already brought the goods here across the ocean and have them close to your customers, that really would be the bonded warehouse option versus the foreign trade zone piece. Sorry, I'm not seeing that. A mix of different goods there. We would classify all of them each individually, unless they're coming in as a package, prepackaged set and being sold that way as a set. Then you would basically break it out and you put what they call a classification. You assign an HTS number to it, and that's really what drives what the duty rates are and what of these various tariffs applies to it. It's not just it's what the product is and the origin of the product are really the two driving factors there. But each, we have shipments all the time for customers where they've got, multiple or even dozens of different products on the same shipment. And if they all fall under the same classification, that's fine. You can enter them that way. If they're various, different products, then you break it out on the entry and the duties would be applied at whatever rate applies to each one of those individual products. So we see a mix of that all the time. It's perfectly normal, and that's just what we expect on most shipments. So there'd be a mix of products there. So yeah, in this case, I guess what you're really doing is coming back to the Incoterms side of it, the agreement between you and that manufacturer on basically whose responsibility is in that. A lot of times you see the Incoterms is a rabbit hole of its own, and I don't want to jump into a long discussion there, but Incoterms, you're deciding who's paying for the pickup at origin, who's paying for the export formalities that might need to be done with customs in that country for the product to leave. Then you have the international, like the ocean freight or air freight. And then you have customs on this side. You have the delivery on this side. The Incoterms really set out who is paying for what in that process. And so I think in that scenario, you'd want to find an Incoterm that was agreeable. In this instance, maybe delivered duty paid would be appropriate, where the shipper or the manufacturer is responsible for finding a freight forwarder, customs broker, carrier, all of those different things to be able to move the goods from their facility all the way to you at the destination. And just think of that as like buying something from Amazon, or one of these other online retailers like that, where they just deliver it to you, and you're not really having to think about customs duties or anything else, even though it did cross a border. All of that is upstream with them, and there's nothing that's coming from you. So I think driving that down to where you're changing the Incoterm to a delivered duty paid type of a situation would be the way to resolve that. Yeah, I think we touched on this a little bit. The wording in the current agreement is the duty rates applied based on what on when the goods are entered here. Either you're making an entry because the shipment arrived, or you're making an entry because you withdrew it from a bonded warehouse. And when it's that entry date, that's what's driving it. Now, if there's a change in the agreements that are in place right now, we're going to have to see what that wording is in that new agreement before we can really know for sure what date would apply there. If they keep it the same, though, it would be based on when you make entry and not based on when it arrived or departed.
So as we move forward, I'm just going to start by reading the question out loud. That way the transcription can pick it up, and anybody who is listening but not watching can know what the question being asked is. Scott Morris asks, can you speak to the definition of country of origins? I've seen several members of our industry discuss potential packaging options that won't change COO, and I think it would be good to discuss do's and don'ts.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've had some conversations with customers already along those lines as well. It's easy to have a misunderstanding about rules of origin and just how that works. If you just move product from one country to another and put it on a different vessel and that type of thing, it certainly doesn't change the origin. If you just repackage a product, it's not going to transform it. If you think about going back to that classification thing in the tariff, where a specific number is assigned for each product that you could possibly bring into the country, there's a classification for it. If you're not transforming a product from one classification to something drastically different, then you're not changing the origin of that product, and repackaging and that type of thing would not satisfy it. An example that I always use is like if you had a little red wagon that you bought from China and you moved it to Mexico, and in Mexico you assembled it, and even if you painted it, it was unskilled labor doing that assembly. It did not transform it. You had all the parts there that made a wagon, so even customs basically considers it a wagon even if it's unassembled. And so by doing the assembly in Mexico prior to bringing it into the U.S., you gained nothing with that. You didn't transform it. And the same would work for any other kind of product there. If you had wood and you made it into a table or a chair, then you've transformed it from the classifications for wood into the classifications for furniture, and that would meet the requirement. That would change that country of origin, but packaging certainly would not.
So Tricia Miller says, if you're sourcing products through a third party, either in China or the US, is it okay to separate their profit into a consulting fee that would not be subject to tariffs from the cost of goods sold that they're paying? If the pricing drops because of this from previous shipments, is CBP likely to flag this?
Yeah, I think you guys are really hitting on some interesting topics here to cover. And this is, really kind of gets into a deep dive there. In international trade, you see very often, we see it all the time. I was on the importer side of the fence in textiles and apparel for a long time. There are trading companies that are in the middle of these transactions. There are companies that are sourcing for you, right? They're going into China and these other countries, and they're finding manufacturers, and they're bringing them to you with their products. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they're the ones making those products, or even in the same country where those are. We saw a lot of trading companies in Korea and Taiwan and Singapore making all around the world, in Africa and Central America and things like that. So it's very common for trading partners. And what that really goes into is there's two sales then. So you have a sale from a manufacturer to a middleman, which could be that trading partner. And you have another sale subsequent to that from that middleman or trading company to the ultimate consignee, the person, the actual buyer at the destination side who wants this product. And the customs rules and some rulings that are out there from years ago allow you to use that first sale, so that first invoice, for customs purposes. Now, that means that manufacturer and that trading company are divulging that to you, and to get them to do that, you've got to have a certain level of relationship there for them to allow you to be kind of privy to that insider piece like that. But if you can get that invoice, and the other caveat is that invoice is complete. It has to include all of the costs related to making that product. If you look at just an apparel example of that, if that middleman or that trading company is providing fabric to that manufacturer and all they're doing is the cutting and sewing of it, then that invoice from the manufacturer is not going to include everything in the cost. And so you wouldn't be able to use it in that case. But if you have it where the middleman's invoice truly is just the profit, his own markup for his all of his tasks, and it's not that they're doing it for nothing. They did a lot of work there and possibly quality checks or help negotiate price, and they're overseeing the production of the product and making sure everything runs on time. There's a lot of things they're getting paid to do, but that part doesn't have to be dutiable, and you could use the first sale invoice there to avoid paying duty on that middleman's profit or markup.
So Andy Daniel says, I guess my last question wasn't clear. That was a question regarding shipping products to China, from China to Canada. So let's say I ship a wood product from China to Canada where I add the packaging and import it under its normal HTS code. How does the tariff or country of origin work?
In that case, you wouldn't change. The product wasn't transformed in any way, so it just moved through Canada. It could be repackaged there, but the origin would remain as China, and you would pay the tariff accordingly.
Okay. Vlad asks, do you still only need to provide a COO document for shipments above $2,200, or does that apply to all shipments from all countries now?
Generally, what we see, it was an actual certificate of origin where that's a physical separate document. It's when there's a free trade agreement in place, and free trade agreements now, when you look at all these layered on tariffs on top of the normal duty, they really don't have a huge impact other than you're not paying that column one duty rate. You're paying the special rate for that country. In a lot of places, that's free. When we're looking at normal shipments that come in from China, Japan, Korea, the European Union, anything like that, we're really just seeing the country of origin on the commercial invoice that we're provided. The only time we're really seeing a certificate of origin issued is when you're qualifying under one of these free trade agreements, and you need that additional documentation to get you that duty-free treatment. That's where that comes into play. And I think maybe under the 2,200, maybe you're looking at the de minimis side, where there's some lower scrutiny to those lower value shipments, but or looking at a formal entry versus informal, which again is in the weeds here. But I think just thinking about the certificate of origin, if you think more of related to a free trade agreement and trying to qualify for some special duty treatment there, that's really when you need to provide it.
So we have another question from Tricia Miller. There are Chinese manufacturers, this actually is a statement, not a question, that would suggest falsely declaring cost of goods to be lower. We're not willing to do this, of course, but how can we be or are protected against this from competitors that will do this, or Chinese manufacturers that will import at lower fake costs to avoid these?
Yeah.
I guess it is a question.
Yeah, it's an interesting scenario, and I think one of the things there is that every import that comes into the U.S., when we're providing the data, the carrier transmits data to customs. They're showing what shipments are moving from what countries and in what volumes and all of that. When we are filing customs entries, we are getting very specific with it. Then we are saying this particular importer from this manufacturer of this product at these values, all of that is being declared. So a couple of things come into play there. One is that Census is collating all of that data, or collecting all of that data and putting it out there. And our system actually, product by product, they actually set some parameters around it. So they know, based on that massive data for all of these imports over all these years, they know what the date range, or I'm sorry, what the price range and all those things should be for those different products coming from different countries. And so that's something that will actually flag within our system if you're outside of those ranges. And when it is, you have to do extra steps to explain that to Census. The other side of it is you have U.S. Customs out there and import specialists all across the country. They're looking at that very thing. And so they're looking at that same kind of data. And if something's outside of a certain range, they're going to be questioning it as well. And another very interesting piece to it that I really wasn't aware of early in my career, but kind of became aware of it later on, just seeing the other side of this. Those U.S. manufacturers there and other competitors, there are different lobby groups that exist out there who are looking at that same stuff as well. And so there's beyond the enforcement of customs, you kind of have your competitors in the industry, and you have U.S. manufacturers out there basically as watchdogs, looking at that and reporting things that they see into those authorities where they feel like some of that abuse might be happening. So I think it's a multi-tiered thing. And I do think that anything where it was misdeclared or something of that sort, then they would be held accountable by customs during any kind of audit that may come along as well.
Scott Morris asks this question. Many of us work with Chinese manufacturers who outsource various components, but we often don't know the sources. For customs, most publishers list China as the country of origin for these, even though they may only manufacture 10 to 20% and assemble the rest. If over 50% of components come from outside China, should we request a line item source list, or is that too detailed to matter if customs just considers it all from China anyway?
It really gets very technical there, and that's something that where you have a couple of different paths to take there in that kind of analysis. There may be a limit to what I would want to do for you as a customs broker, because there's going to be a big impact to it. I do think it's an exercise that's worth going through, because what you want to see is the manufacturing, the work done to assemble and do any other work to the product there is a component to it, the labor and everything that goes into it, but also the regional value content. There's a lot of different things that go into rules of origin, and you would have to look at how the value of those foreign components weighed into the value of the labor and other components from China. So it's not just the components themselves, but it's also the work that goes into it, and that's an exercise that's worth going into if you can get them to dive into it with you, for sure. And it just may get technical enough where you would want to involve a customs attorney to help walk you through it, to make sure you do it right and file that correctly. If you felt like you had a case where more of these components came from Taiwan and from Japan or something like that than from China, it depends on what the product is, of course, but you could absolutely make a case there, and I do think it would be worth looking at.
That appears to be all the questions we have for the moment. We do have 10 more minutes if anybody wants to share some more questions in the chat. I think we're having one here. Matt Whitbrook says, I'm finding the language around transformation to be very subjective in relation to COO. We're considering a transformation of an originally Chinese manufactured board game in a country with a lower tariff. Is there a clear standard on how much needs to be altered for this to be compliant?
There are, and it's something you would really have to dive into in detail. I don't think we could cover enough of it in enough detail off the top of my head here to be useful. I would say that there are different agreements out there with different countries. It gets very specific that way. If there's any country with a free trade agreement in place, then the rules of origin around that get very specific. So you'd have to really dive into that in more detail too. And then when anything that was NAFTA related, or the USMCA with Canada and Mexico, that has its own specific sets of rules of origin around it. And so I think you'd have to get into the very specifics of what that language looked like. We'd be glad to look at that with you. If we couldn't get you to a point where you were happy with the answer, I hate to keep plugging customs attorneys here. I don't get commission out of them or anything like that. But we do refer you to that as well to kind of walk through that exercise. When you think of the implications with some of these tariffs, especially with China, and the implications of them, and how massive that is on your business there, because you're layering on all these different costs, it's well worth the time and energy and some spend there to get the right guidance so you can make good decisions. The worst thing for me as a customs broker, there's just a limit to where I can go with that, because at a certain point, the worst thing I would want to do is give you bad advice. I want to make sure you get good advice to make good decisions on, because it's just, it's not going to do you any good, and it's going to burn the relationship I have with you. So we'll walk you to a certain point with the conversation and provide some insight there if that's useful. If you already have a customs broker in place, they can do that same sort of analysis. But the deep dive to really get a legal opinion would be that next level with an attorney.
Okay, so I think that about does it with the questions for now. I just want to take a minute to thank Andy and Tony and Amanda and Stephen. I feel like I'm on the romper room. And Jordan, who's in the background operating the slides, from Steam Logistics, who took the time out of their day to help us out here. There's going to be another question, so we don't want to go anywhere yet. But in any case, thank you all for your time. Thank you so much for this feedback. It really has been helpful.
Yeah, thanks very much for having us.
Yeah, thank you, David. Also, real quick, I just want to let everybody know that we do appreciate your time, because we know how big and important this is to each of your industries. Many of you probably know me from my work at Gen Con or in the games industry chat, helping out many of you, and I've even run games for you at conventions, or met with you and had drinks with you. We wanted to put this on because we know how heady this conversation can be, and there's no clear and easy answer, as you saw. Steve gave such great, wonderful detail about the over expenditure of it. We know that some of it may not have been pinpointed towards you, but it's good to know your understanding of knowledge and history. When you're talking about paper products, games, toys, plastic models, wood pieces, and things of that nature, all of that comes down to the same sort of idea. We want to help you through that as much as we can from an educational standpoint, or even on a client-customer basis. We thank David for reaching out to us with GAMA. It's been a pleasure working with him. He's been very astute. I'll let the other question come in here real quick. I apologize. But I did want to say thank you, and know that we're all here rooting for you from all sizes of businesses, from your upstart Kickstarters all the way to your big boys at Hasbro and Bandai, or your distributors. We'll be glad to answer any further questions in detail. We have another slide with our contact information, but you'll be able to find us on the GAMA website soon, as we will be a participating member moving forward.
Okay, so last question here. Mike asks, had a shipment show up right between 20% and 10% from EU. Later that day, after customs processing, the EU 20% was paused. That was April 9th. Is there anything he can file with customs to get some of that back?
Yeah, absolutely. So the easiest thing to do if you were going to catch it right then, the duties and taxes are not paid. You're making entry on the product to get the cargo release so you can pick it up from the port or from the rail or whatever. But the duties are paid a little bit downstream from there. And so if you catch it, that's, today's the 24th. I don't know. That's a couple of weeks. It probably has been paid at this point. If it has not, then they should be able to modify that customs entry and make that change, because you'd be able to put that new piece in place. If it had already been paid, then you just have another step to the process, and that's post-summary correction, where the customs broker can go in and pay it on the point of clearing. Okay, so in that case, you would go back and do this. After the fact, it becomes what's called a post-summary correction. But that's, you have quite a bit of time to be able to go back and do that. I don't know if they would charge you for having to rework it or not. That's kind of between you and them, but it is simple as enough to file, and you can file it right at, like for us, we would file it right out of our own system and be able to transmit that correction. And then customs has to approve that as well. So they're going to review it in that case. If you catch it before it's paid, then it's just an easy, simple transmitting an update. But once you're doing a post-summary correction, you kind of put it in customs court to review it and approve it, and then they would do whatever kind of refund there to you.
Great. That sounds like we cleared that one up a little bit. No customs pun intended. Thanks so much for all your time. I see your thank you slide up there. If there's anything else you want to share about that, go ahead.
This will just be your general contact information here. You can use the QR codes or just the email. Like I mentioned earlier, of course, is that you'll be able to find our information to ask further questions or even, to see what we have available to you. And again, thank you, David, and thank you, GAMA, for helping us present this.
All right. And thank you to all of you. And that's our webinar for today. Please stop by and visit the Tariff Town Hall. The Zoom link was placed in the chat, and oh, look, there it is on the screen, where the board, along with John Stacy, will be discussing some of our responses and movement regarding the tariffs as well. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Great talking to you all. Thank you.